thanks everyone for taking the time today. I'll spend the next 20 minutes or so kind of talking about how to secure the everywhere enterprise, a narrative we've kind of been talking about for a little while, but I think is incredibly timely given kind of the current state of things around the globe. So just real quick, got to put this little disclaimer up. We'll skip past that. For those of you that don't know much about MobileIron, just 2 quick seconds on the company. We've been around for about 12 years. We have a little over 20,000 customers around the globe. We manage over 12 million business critical endpoints every single day. And we've been recognized by research analysts as a market leader in our space, really since the inception of the company. So I'm going to start today by making the contention that really mobile is at the center of our universe. And to kind of back up my position on that, if you look at, there's some really interesting data around how users interact with devices. First of all, and these are 2019 statistics, I think these are going to be blown away in 2020, given the current state of things. But just to give you some kind of perspective on it, the average person in 2019 looked at their mobile device about 80 times a day. I think we're way past that at this point in time. This is a really interesting secondary statistic, and this switch actually happened about 4 years ago, which was that more web traffic is actually done and more websites are visited from a mobile device, a tablet or a phone today than your traditional laptop or desktop. And the reason that's particularly interesting from a statistical perspective is if you go way back to 2007 when the iPhone was launched, everyone said no one will ever use that device to browse the web or interact with websites. Well, in reality, it took us less than a decade to actually overtake the traditional medium that we used. And then you have the fact that already today in the marketplace coming into 2020, there were 3 times as many smartphones in folks' hands as there are PCs. And really this is leading the way for a real major transformation in the way that enterprises interact with applications and they interact with mobile devices and devices kind of in general, and how we have to go about securing them is shifting in a meaningful way. And if you look at just some really interesting statistics about apps and app consumption outside of the enterprise and what's happening, and we hear these terms like shadow IT and the such, but there's really interesting behavioral statistics to be gathered around what our users are doing with mobile devices, whether they be devices they get on their own or devices that are company issued. And the first one is really the types of applications that they're downloading. So number one, far and away, we download more games than we do anything else, both on the Apple App Store and the Google Play Store. But what's interesting is this second category of applications, which is called business. And what's really interesting about that category is when I present that statistic, and I've talked about it both internally and to customers around the globe, they say, well, I kind of expected that to be the case, Alex, because everybody uses email and productivity applications. But what's interesting is that that's actually not what's housed in the business category of apps. That actually sits in its own category called productivity, both with Apple and with Google. And so you say, well, what is in this business category? And I pulled out one example here, and that's Slack. The reason I like to use Slack as an example is they kind of skyrocketed out of nowhere in a market that was already very heavily saturated with competitors, and they drove their solution into the marketplace basically by avoiding all of us in IT and selling to line of business users. And if you look at where they closed out in 2019, they had over 7 million daily active users using their technology, almost all of which kind of circumvented the traditional IT centers. And then you have this shift happening globally, even while we're dealing with the pandemic, where we're shifting from 4G networks to 5G networks. And the reason this matters is that even the most sophisticated networks that you may have built for your employee populations when and if they do return to the office, those Wi-Fi networks and other networks we've invested so heavily in, they're actually slower and less reliable than 5G infrastructure that's being built out by carriers all across the globe. And that's going to cause for an interesting conundrum for IT folks. If I'm already connected to a network that's faster and better than what you're able to serve me up at a particular location, why would I switch from one network to the other? So mobile devices, of course, clearly provide access to everything. And there's this notion and this concept, it was really coined by Gartner to begin with, but we've sort of been telling this story in one form or fashion for a little while, which is this idea that the enterprise is really everywhere, or the everywhere enterprise is the era that we've moved into. And I think we were definitely down this path, and it was probably a path that was going to take us between 3 to 5 years to hit, except for this wonderful pandemic that we're all dealing with and managing today. And really the concept behind the everywhere enterprise is that customers are ubiquitous, right? They're everywhere, and every business, regardless of whether you're providing a service or a product, wants to get to a customer that wants to consume our products. I joke around about the fact that even MobileIron, not a particularly huge company, really the sun kind of never sets on our customers and on our team, which is spread out all over the world. You have the reality that in today's world, with the adoption of cloud technology that was happening pre-pandemic and even potentially accelerated for many organizations during the pandemic, infrastructure and subsequently data is everywhere. And then, of course, with the given working conditions today and potentially into the long-term future, you have the reality that workers are everywhere. But we really faced a scenario where a lot of this was happening pre-pandemic, and I think the pandemic really kind of accelerated our time to face this simple reality that the everywhere enterprise is very much here and here to stay. So you have this adoption of mobile and cloud that's taking place. The traditional perimeter-based security models that we've used for the last, you could argue, 60 plus years from an IT perspective are really not sufficient any longer in the real world. And the reason behind that is because we have this interdependence and this massive hang up on this 60-year-old technology called the password. For those of you that don't know, the password from an IT perspective was actually originally introduced at MIT, my alma mater, from a grad school perspective. And it was introduced for one very specific purpose, which is, how do I stop Alex, who's got a small research grant, from tapping into Kara, who's got a big research grant. We both want to use the mainframe at the university, except I only have 10 grand of research funds and Kara has 100 grand, but I need $15,000 of time on the mainframe. Well, I would be cheating, and that's what would happen. So they introduced this simple concept of, let's put a password, something that only Alex knows, something that only Kara knows. Was never defined or designed to be what we subsequently turned the password into. And the proof point kind of behind that is that if you look at things like breach data, and we'll dive into even some information around pandemic statistics around this as well. Coming into this year, you had 2019, 81% of all breaches, and this has been a consistent statistic for the last decade, involved weak, default, or stolen password credentials. And the reason for that is not only are passwords inherently not secure, but they're also not user-friendly. If you look at how many times your user population today, both pre-pandemic and even in the current state of work, have to interact with their passwords, they're not user-friendly. And also passwords are inherently not intelligent. It's just a username and a password. We sometimes try to add a layer of intelligence to that using multi-factor authentication, but even traditional MFA sources really don't add a lot of intelligence to it. It's sometimes a username, a password, and then a password on top of the password that we ask the user to interact with. And then if you look specifically at mobile, there's really some interesting statistics to gather around how we're investing in securing these devices that have critical access to our data and information. And it's really a minimal investment that we've made in securing devices that are inherently being used more than the devices that we tend to invest disproportionately in. So if you look at 2020, again, this was some predictions pre-pandemic. These weren't MobileIron statistics. These were gathered by a number of different sources like Gartner and other analyst groups. And they said coming into the year, we were going to see pre-pandemic 5 times as many mobile devices shipped out into the marketplace than traditional endpoints. So laptops, desktops, et cetera, more mobile devices to the tune of 5x. 60% of enterprise endpoints are mobile already, again, pre-pandemic. You have the reality that 3 times as many hours are spent on mobile devices than traditional endpoints. And I'd challenge any of you on the conversation today, if you haven't looked recently at your screen time on either your iPhone or your Android device, both of them track them wonderfully for us. Not only go look at how many hours you spend in the typical day or week on the device, but look at the applications that you're actually spending time in. I think you'll be quite surprised in how much actual corporate communications and corporate data is spent viewing and looking and engaging with on that mobile device. But then you have the simple reality that if you look at total IT spend at around $124 billion last year, by the way, growing to the tune of about $500 billion by 2025, we invested just 0.5% in protecting those critical mobile endpoints. So less than almost any other area from a security perspective, certainly relative to its value in the organization and to your employees. And those are not unique statistics that only, I at MobileIron seem to know and have figured out. Hackers have definitely started to pivot and are setting their sights on mobile devices. And there's a couple different reasons as to why that's happening and why that's happening right now in particular, and why you need to be paying attention to it. Well, first of all, you can look at some really interesting statistics that have happened, kind of with the beginning of and through the COVID crisis. I grabbed some headlines off the web, but there's many of them out there from the FBI here in the US to all types of organizations that track things like phishing attacks, that track things like security breaches that involve mobile devices. And if you look at it, the FBI has come out with some interesting statistics that say, kind of post the beginning of COVID lockdown, we've seen an uptick to the tune of about 300% in the attacks against mobile devices. And the reason behind why that is the case and why mobile devices are so appealing from an attack perspective and specifically from a phishing perspective is that they really leverage deception. And to be successful as a cyber criminal and as a hacker, you really have to take a lead and take a position on how do I successfully deceive you into taking a particular action. And if you think about a mobile device and why deception is so easy on them and why hackers are now spending so much time and attention on these devices, it's really very simple to understand. First, you have a very small screen, which really limits the amount of information that a user can be presented with at any given point in time. So when a user sees a message, whether it be an email, an SMS message, if it's an iPhone, an iMessage, or a WhatsApp message, you're generally looking at a very small subset of information. And also our devices, because of the way that we interact with them, we've trained ourselves to make very fast decisions on mobile devices, decisions that we tend to take much slower on traditional endpoints like laptops and desktops, where we'll investigate more because we have more real estate. We also tend to just interact with those devices very differently with keyboards and mice and whatnot versus our finger and the mobile nature of your phone or tablet. It's also very difficult to authenticate where a message is coming from. There's been some really interesting scams that have happened here lately. All of you have probably interacted with a financial institution or some retail location that sends maybe an MFA to you via SMS or a text message. It's very difficult oftentimes to authenticate that because it comes from maybe a 5 to 6 digit code, and you may have requested it, but you don't always know when that's happened. Hackers are also able to replicate those codes. It's not a very difficult thing to do. You can spend about 15 minutes learning how to do it on YouTube. Very easy process to do, very easy thing to take credentials from that user and direct them to a specific site. Also, when you look at things on a mobile device, it's often difficult to look at things side by side, to be able to verify things like links that come across, especially if you're using things like bit.ly links or shortened condensed links. We use those all the time on mobile devices. So it's very difficult to verify that link before you click on it. And if you need proof point behind that, we'll dissect a little bit further, but start to think about the Twitter hack that just happened about 6-8 weeks or so ago. And what happened in that case, just a bunch of teenagers who figured out how to successfully compromise Twitter in a fairly what would seem on the surface to be sophisticated attack, but a very basic attack at that as well. And here's just an example of how for simple an attack on a mobile device that may be coming from outside the traditional phishing sources of email might be. In this case, an SMS based, or it could be a WhatsApp message or any type of messaging platform, comes from something named CB, which could very easily be Chase Bank. Again, it could be coming from a 5-digit code. You know, if I'm on my mobile device, I get a quick pop-up, looks like it says, hey, here's a Chase Bank alert, your account's below $25. You can imagine that would cause me a tremendous amount of panic, as I'm sure it would yours as well. And if I'm in my car, if I'm at an event with kids or doing anything that we're doing these days to try to escape the confines of our house, I get a bit.ly link, click on it, and you can, again, use the Twitter example, how easy it is to spoof a landing page. I could spoof a landing page, log in with my credentials, and the rest of the story is history. So these things are very easy to do. Hackers have figured it out, and if you haven't gotten an SMS-based phishing attack, you will. And for those of you that have, you've certainly seen this happen many, many times before. So what do we need to do about all of this? Well, we need to start thinking about security very differently. We need to start to apply a zero trust approach to how we secure our environments. And it's really all about this idea that we never trust but always verify. And we do that because we assume that really Alex is the same as potentially a bad actor, and that they're already on our network and in our infrastructure. And we need to do this across 5 key different areas. We need to validate the device that the user is connecting with. We need to establish a contextual relationship between the user, the data, and the application that they're accessing that data with. We need to make sure that the app that they're using is one that we know and trust. For example, if you look at Salesforce.com, an app that I'm sure many of you have used or possibly have in your environment, there's over 100 different commercially available applications out in the Apple App Store or Google Play Store that can connect to your instance of Salesforce.com. Is that an application you know and trust? Is it one that you want your users using? And does it do things with your data that you approve? We need to be able to verify the network that the user is connecting to. So is it a network that we know and trust? Is it just an open Wi-Fi network? And what are the risks associated with that? And then last but not least, we need to be able to detect and remediate threats. And if you look at it, there's really 3 different ways to achieve zero trust. There's an identity-centric approach, which has a good approach from an ability to give a user credentials to be able to gain access to applications and data, but it has that dependency still on passwords, also limits your visibility to device apps and threats. The other school of thought on how you can achieve zero trust is around gateways. So do it at the network level, but funnel everything back through a single gateway. The challenge there is that already coming into 2020, about 25% of enterprise traffic doesn't go through the traditional enterprise network. I bet you if you looked at that today, you're probably looking at a statistic that's much closer to 50, if not 75% of data doesn't traverse your network or go through your network infrastructure to be able to get the user out to the data and information. And then last but not least is a mobile-centric approach. And again, my contention that mobile is at the center of your life. It gives you that correlation between the user, the device, the application, the network, and your threat posture for you automatically. There's 4 things that you have to do to achieve zero trust. You need to be able to provision users to devices, applications, profiles, and policies. You need to be able to grant contextual access. So you're looking at things like the user, the device, the app, the network, time, location, operating system, probably no more relevant than the world that we're living in today. Where are my users coming in from? What's the location? What's the threat associated with the device that's trying to connect to my data? I need to be able to protect that data that's at rest on devices and in motion. And I need to be able to eliminate threats that exist on device. And then, of course, even in a pandemic situation, we still have policies and rules, whether they be corporate policies or regulatory requirements that we have to enforce across those users and devices. So really, a mobile-centric approach to zero trust provides you with that correlation and provides you with all of those steps that you have to achieve zero trust. So mobile, in my opinion, more powerful than you think. ever present in our lives, probably no more so than right now dealing with the pandemic. Biometrics are certainly becoming our identity. They were pre-pandemic. If you think about things like how you travel around the world, coming back into the US, we use biometrics to validate you. When you travel to places like Europe, we were already using biometrics as identity. We use biometrics as identity in our personal consumer lives on our mobile devices. So you have to ask yourselves, well, if it's good enough in those worlds, why potentially is it not good enough in my enterprise world? And when you combine these two factors together, biometrics and the ever-presence nature of your device, you can create some pretty amazing user and in today's world, consumer experiences, but in the near future, enterprise experiences for your users. And we did a survey with IDG, got two blast statistics to share with you, that 86% of CISOs that were surveyed, and this survey went across the global 2000, said that if they could do away with passwords, they believe they could reduce their risk of breach by as much as 50%. That's pretty staggering when you think about that 81% statistic that I shared earlier. And then looking out, IDG did a further study and said, well, looking out 5 years from now, what do you think identity will look like in the enterprise? And 9 out of 10 of these security leaders that were surveyed, so about 90% of the global 2000, said that they believe mobile devices will become your identity. And then you look at things like Gartner, who's come out recently and said, look, passwordless is here and getting more aggressive by the moment. We need to move into a world where passwordless authentication is really driving behavior for all of the advantages that I talked about earlier. So when you look at it from a MobileIron perspective, we very much started to focus in on about 2.5, 3 years ago, right as I joined the company, in this idea that we could make mobile devices your identity and your authentication into the enterprise, and as a result of that, be able to forget your password literally. So with that, I'm going to stop and open it up for any questions that are out there.
Great, thanks, Alex. Just as a reminder, if you do have a question, you can hop on over to the chat box in the event portal. So, Alex, what is the new normal in data security going to look like as states are opening back up?
So a good question. So I think that the new normal is going to look very much like it looks for all of us today. I think that the current state of how we are managing users, whether they be employees or partners to our data and our access to our data and our infrastructure, is going to remain not only for the short term, but really begin to shift into the long term. And you look at many organizations have come out recently and said, you know, first we had to move to kind of a work from home, work remote, everywhere enterprise approach to our environment just to kind of survive, right? Keep the lights on mode for the first about 3 to 6 months as we moved into this pandemic situation and world that we live in, to now organizations trying to optimize employee productivity and access. And that, of course, puts a huge burden on IT and IT security. So now you're trying to have to think about, how do I optimize the current environment to be able to allow access for users to infrastructure and to data. I think once they do that, the shift backwards will probably not take place for most organizations, because once I start to gain productivity in one particular way, it won't make sense for me to try to shift back and then try to regain productivity in the old way of doing things. So I think this medium and this approach, like I said, I thought we were on this, my belief is we were on this path anyways. It was just going to take us about 3 to 5 years to be able to get there. And the pandemic has really accelerated that in a significant way.
So then on that note, with work from home potentially lasting, you know, even with the states opening up, how can you continue to have productivity without crashing your VPN?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the key is really how you manage that productivity. And, you know, my belief has been for a long time that one of the key objectives for security folks today and into the future is going to be, how do I provide that balance between user experience and security? And there are things that you can do, like make, for example, you mentioned VPN, make the VPN process one that's totally seamless for the end user. So when they launch a particular application, so only in that application or that service does the VPN connect. And then as soon as they're done with that application or that service, it automatically disconnects. And all of that happens seamless so that as a user, I don't have to worry about, did I connect right now? Am I still connected to the VPN? Constantly rechecking that, calling the help desk only to find out that that my VPN is dropped. So there are ways to be able to automate those processes and really help you find that balance point between providing the level of security that you're looking for, and ideally an advanced level of security than what you're providing today, and optimizing for user experience. Because if you go too far on one way or the other, right? If you go too far on user experience, you might eliminate and limit some of the security that you could have in place to help optimize the user from being able to do what they need to do and not think about security. Or if you go too far on the security side of things, not only do you potentially create a problem where you limit productivity, but more importantly, the user might just totally circumvent the processes that you put in place. And that's where, you know, shadow IT comes from, right? They just go out and consume a service on their own without the approval of your organization or entity.
Great. So we do have a couple minutes left, but this might be a good question to end on. You know, organizations needing continuous visibility into who is accessing what data and whether that data access is good or bad. And so what are some steps that you think, you know, need to be taken to assure success for an organization?
So I think the first thing that you have to do is really focus in on the piece that I just mentioned a moment ago, right? That balance between security and user experience. If you're going to be successful in the world going forward from a security vantage point, you have to consider user experience. You have to assume that whatever I'm doing from a security perspective, a user has the potential to view as a negative. So what you want to do is look at whatever security policy or technology you put in place. How does this actually improve my users' experience so that they can adopt technology and do their job faster? So think about things like, you know, just the shift in your own personal life. Take, for example, you as a consumer of, let's use banking applications and banking services. The old way was, you know, have maybe one central bank location where everyone had to go to stand in line, to then we evolved to branch locations, right? Where the bank has services that they're providing in my neighborhood, to then those branch locations started to introduce things like ATMs, to where if all I wanted to do was cash a check, I could kind of do it 24 hours a day, do it securely, you know, use multiple factors of authentication, what I have in an ATM card, what I know in a PIN code to be able to gain access to it. That evolution to now today, where you're using things like your mobile device to be able to gain access to all of your financial information, be able to transact directly from that device. You no longer even interact oftentimes with that username and password to be able to get to your applications. You're doing that all via biometrics, and things are becoming simpler and simpler. And I think you have to think about that evolution from a security perspective the exact same way, because your users are already experiencing that in their consumer lives. So they're simply going to ask you the question, if it's so easy for me to do business with an organization or entity as a consumer of their services, why is it so difficult for me to be able to do so as an employee? And I ask this question all the time to financial institutions in particular. If I'm a consumer of their services, I don't want to think that they're investing disproportionately in securing their employees, thus making them more secure and providing a worse user experience than they are me as an actual consumer. I want that actually paradigm to be flipped, which is that as a consumer of your services, you're disproportionately investing in protecting me.